Our presentation is on the mechanics of breathing and the pathway of air in respiration. The overview of the respiratory system is given on this slide. As you can see, there are two parts to the respiratory system, airways and gas exchange surfaces, and the chest wall. We will begin by talking about airways and gas exchange surfaces. The first part of the respiratory system is the nose and nasal cavity. The nose is the main conducting airway for inhaled air, which enters through the paired nostrils. The nose is supported superiorly by the paired nasal bones. The internal surface of the nose leads to the nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity is continuous posteriorly with the nasopharynx via paired openings called the choanae, or posterior nares. So next up is the pharynx, and the pharynx is commonly called the throat, and it is a part of both the respiratory and the digestive system. So the pharynx is located near the beginning of the respiratory tract. It has three parts: the nasopharynx, which is located from the posterior nares to the soft palate, the oropharynx, located between the soft palate to the hyoid bone, and the hypopharynx, which is located from the hyoid bone to the esophagus. The main function of the pharynx is to conduct air to the lower respiratory tract. The larynx is a cylindrical airway structure composed of 9 pieces of cartilage. These pieces of cartilage are supported by ligaments and skeletal muscle. The larynx is continuous superiorly with the hypopharynx and inferiorly with the trachea. The non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is superior to the vocal folds, and the pseudostratified ciliated columnar is inferior to the vocal folds. The larynx opens the glottis to allow for the conduction of air. It also assists in the cough reflex by increasing abdominal pressure. To cough, the abdominal muscles contract and the larynx closes the glottis to prevent air from escaping. This increases the pressure in the abdominal cavity. Then the glottis opens, allowing for the forceful expulsion of air. The trachea lies inferior to the larynx and superior to the main bronchi in the lungs. The trachea has 15 to 20 C-shaped rings, also called tracheal cartilages. Cartilage rings are joined together by annular ligaments. Trachealis muscle and a thin membrane bind open ends of each tracheal cartilage. The main function of the trachea is to transport air from the larynx to the primary bronchi and hence the lungs. Tracheal cartilage offers support and makes sure the trachea stays open so airflow is continuous. Trachealis muscle stretches and contracts according to demand. For example, it'll stretch inwards when swallowing a big bite of food to allow the esophagus to expand, and it'll constrict to restrict air when coughing. Next up are the bronchi and bronchioles. There is one bronchi for each lung. Bronchi branch into secondary and tertiary bronchi, then eventually bronchioles. The left lung has 2 secondary or lobar bronchi, and the right lung has 3, and this is 1 for each lobe. The left lung has 8 to 10 tertiary or segmental bronchi, and the right lung has 10. Terminal bronchioles branch to form respiratory bronchioles, and these subdivide to form alveolar ducts. The function of the bronchi is to conduct air into the lungs, and the function of bronchioles is to transport air to the alveoli. So the bronchioles are the final passageway for air to enter the alveoli. So an important note to keep in mind is that bronchi and bronchioles only act as the passageway for air, and no gas exchange occurs within them. The amount of air traveling through the bronchial tree is regulated by the constriction and dilation of bronchioles. The alveoli are the terminal end of the respiratory tree. They are formed as small sacs called alveolar sacs, and this is where gas and blood exchange occurs. There's 2 types of alveolar wall, the squamous alveolar cell and the septal cell. The squamous alveolar cell promotes gas exchange, and the septal cell secretes a fluid that reduces surface tension to prevent the collapse of the alveoli. So as mentioned in the previous slide, alveoli are the site of gas exchange. They allow oxygen and carbon monoxide between the lungs and the bloodstream. Blood capillaries surround each alveoli to facilitate gas exchange, and the blood in capillaries on the surface of the alveoli diffuses its carbon dioxide and takes up oxygen. So next we have the lungs. The base of the lungs is inferior to the muscular diaphragm, and the apex is superior to the clavicle. It's bordered by the thoracic wall anteriorly, laterally, and posteriorly, and is supported by the rib cage. The lungs each have 3 regions: the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe, and the lungs are separated from each other by the mediastinum. And we have the diaphragm. The diaphragm performs the majority of the work in the breathing process. As it relaxes and moves back up, the elasticity of the lungs and chest wall pushes air out of the lungs. It's a large sheet of muscle attached to the base of the sternum and the lower part of the rib cage. It separates the chest cavity and the abdomen. The ribcage also has a role in breathing. The biggest one is to protect the lungs. The wall of the thoracic cavity is formed by the ribcage and connecting muscles, skin, and fascia, which helps protect the lungs from outside forces. The intercostal muscles run between the ribs. The external intercostals raise the ribcage and, along with the diaphragm, expand the chest cavity to draw air into the lungs. The internal intercostals lower the ribcage and, along with the diaphragm, cause the chest cavity to contract and force air out. The abdomen's role in breathing is in the exhalation process during exercise. It contracts and pushes air out of the lungs more rapidly during physical activity. So what does the breathing process look like then? Well, inhalation is an active process and begins when the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract to make the chest cavity smaller. As the muscles contract, the lungs expand and air is sucked through the nose and mouth. The nose filters, wets, and warms the air before it passes through the lower respiratory tract. The oxygen-rich air then flows down the bronchial tubes and into the alveoli. Gas exchange occurs between the air in the alveoli and the red blood cells located in the blood in the capillaries, and the blood then becomes oxygen-rich. At the same time, carbon dioxide, a waste product carried in the blood and RBCs, moves into the alveoli. The air rich in CO2 flows out of the alveoli and bronchial tubes towards the nose and the mouth. Then exhalation occurs when the diaphragm and ribcage muscles relax to make the chest cavity smaller. Air rich in carbon dioxide is forced out of the lungs and through the nose and mouth. In contrast to inhalation, exhalation is a passive process unless you have lung disease or engaging in physical activity. As noted in a previous slide, during exercise, the abdominal muscles contract and push your diaphragm against your lungs. We have 3 discussion questions to finish off our presentation. The first one is, how is breathing affected when the thoracic wall is punctured by an injury? How can this injury be operated on? The second one is, laryngitis is an inflammation of the larynx that may extend to its surrounding structures. How can an inflamed larynx impact someone's ability to breathe? And the last one is, pneumonia is an infection of the alveoli of the lung. What key process of breathing does pneumonia compromise? Thank you for listening.